So Britain, along with other nations at least, went through this cycle of moving towards a more and more inclusive economic and political institutions as the Industrial Revolution happened, and like all the way through to the modern day. I, however, have seen and read quite a lot of work that would suggest, and they used the word extractive before I'd heard you use it. So it was really interesting. I'd read the work of Nicholas Shaxson, who wrote about the size of the financial industry as a curse, as much like a resource curse would work. I don't want to spend forever going into the thesis, but essentially, quite a few commentators or economists, journalists have suggested that quite a lot of the modern institutions of nations like Britain and America have become far more extractive over the past 30 to 40 years. Now, obviously, we're still in a much better position than we were 100 years ago. But I was wondering if you saw any credence in the idea that Britain is shifting from a virtuous circle towards a vicious circle of more extractive institutions, or is that just all of us crybaby snowflakes that have never seen real adversity?
I mean, I think it's an important set of issues to think about. My view is, there is some evidence of that. I mean, there's a lot of evidence in the United States of, increasing monopoly power, and there's been sort of the average Americans' purchasing power of their wages have been stagnating for the last 30 years, where all these billionaires have appeared, And that, you've seen that before in the United States history. You saw that after the Civil War, this so-called, all these robber barons, the so-called Gilded Age, Rockefeller, all of these people, Vanderbilt. So it's not like that's the first time that it's happened under capitalism. But I do think there is, evidence of more extractive institutions in some dimensions. I would say, it's pretty small relative to the difference between an inclusive and extractive society. Most of my work is in developing countries, and so I just spent a month in Nigeria, for example, this summer. So after you've spent a month in Nigeria, the idea that there's some radical pall sitting over the British economy is a little bit much to take, actually. But I think that's definitely a concern. I mean, one thing we point out in Why Nations Fail is that, there's many societies in history that went off the rails. You can revert from extractive to inclusive institutions. There's nothing inevitable about the success of Britain or Western Europe or the United States, and that's for sure. So I think that is important to think about. And I think, the crucial thing is just to look at, where is all this wealth coming from? Do you still see innovation? Do you still see creativity? And I think the answer to that is yes, actually. Most of this enormous wealth is being driven exactly by entrepreneurship, by new technologies, by the spread of the internet. Why are these people so rich? Well, because of globalization, because Zuckerberg because everybody in the world, is looking at Facebook, and Amazon can operate on this enormous scale because of modern technology. So I think that's something to be concerned about for sure. But I don't think there's definitive proof that some of the institutions are becoming more extractive. But I wouldn't say that it's on such a scale that, we should really start talking about, Western societies or North America as being extractive, honestly.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. I mean, I talked to quite a lot of folks that would be considered probably quite radical by some folks. So it's interesting to hear a sort of more measured answer to that question. I had, for example, Paul Mason on the show, The Economist. And he is, quite keen to tear down capitalism and the structures that we have in favor of something new. And I had the discussion with him that it's maybe not the best idea, because tearing things down often leads to, worse things being put in their place, unless you've thought it through a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I would think about the politics of that. I think it's sort of undeniable that what you're calling, what we're talking about as capitalism is associated with enormous improvements in living standards, in the last 200 years. And in some sense, the problem in a place like Nigeria, you could say, is that capitalism hasn't really spread to Nigeria in the way that it flourishes in the Western world, and and there's lots of institutional and political reasons for that, I would say. Can you imagine creating prosperity with alternative institutions? I think you can imagine it. It just hasn't happened in world history so far. In economics, there's a lot of discussion of this going all the way back to the 1930s, about could central planning generate the same level of prosperity as a market economy? So it's a very hot kind of intellectual debate for almost 100 years in economic theory. But I'm a sort of British empiricist, so I, you could show it to me in theory, but I'd like to know if it actually ever happened in practice. So I think one should be a little cautious in kind of, I think it is an interesting moment, in world history. It is true at the moment. Like, think about the 19th century. This is actually something Acemoglu and I were discussing the other week, which is, think about the 19th
stay in
century.
Touch. That's
spread
fun.
of,
You stay in touch. That's cool.
Oh,
After
no,
writing the book together.
We're very good friends. Yeah, we're always talking.
Oh, that's cool.
We have many research. We do lots of research projects, like little things. You're talking about the big things, but we do little nerdy scientific things as well. But, think about the 19th century. Think about capitalism, factory system, markets, the Industrial Revolution. Like, at the same time, what do you have? Like the communism, anarchism, like fascism. You have these massive kind of intellectual trends going off in different directions, somehow as a result of the sort of convulsions that are created in society. And I wonder if the same thing is not about to happen again, that, and, maybe that is it, that is indicative of the sort of, there are tectonic changes in the world created by the rise of China, this sort of, the increase in inequality. And so there's a sort of, that's creating an intellectual ferment as well, so it's interesting you should say that about this chap. And, so I'm not quite sure what I think about that. Perhaps I'm being too conservative or something with a small c, but I, it's interesting to think about. Yeah.
No, it's fascinating to think about. I definitely think it's a discussion that I've been having a lot with people. Actually, is there's a lot of talk that like capitalism is the problem, that especially amongst those on the left, and that this is like. And I'm always trying to say is like, look, are you sure it's capitalism and not corruption? And I was listening to an interview you'd done with, I cannot remember who it was, but you said that you felt that using the word corruption is a cop-out for most political scientists or historians and economists because they don't want to talk about politics.
No.
Do you see like corruption within our system to be like a major issue then, or do you find that it's more sort of day-to-day politics that's causing perhaps our inability to move forward on some big issues?
I think you said it exactly right. We don't. The word corruption doesn't appear in Why Nations Fail because that's partly for academic reasons, as you say. Like when an economist starts talking about corruption, it's a way of avoiding talking about politics. So I'm not going to encourage that. That's just economists. And I also, working in Africa a lot, this word corruption is very complicated to sort of think about in an African context. I can give you a very concrete example of that. A very good friend of mine, I can't tell you who he is, but a very good friend of mine became the Minister of Finance of an African country. Okay. And so, this Western idea we have, what's corruption? Corruption is, the use of public resources for private benefit. Okay. But in Africa, but that's a very individualistic way of looking at things. In Africa, people are very embedded in groups, in social networks, with kinship, obligations. And, it's a much more collectivist type. African societies tend to be much more collectivist than Western society with this sort of individualism and kind of, So when you become powerful, you become a minister, you're under all these obligations to use to use this opportunity further the interests of people to whom you're connected to. So in some sense, the morality is like the reverse. You know, in the Western world, you know, if somebody like that uses public resources for their relatives, that would be morally unacceptable. But in Africa, in many contexts, it's actually the opposite is morally unacceptable. It's morally unacceptable not to use your position to further the interests of your social network. So I think that's the reality of it. You know, so that's another reason why I don't like society's organized in a different way, and I think we have to understand that. So berating, you know, these Africans for corruption is just not understanding the logic of the situation. I don't know, like compared to where not to say that there isn't corruption and going on and, you know, whatever. There is. I'm not sure that's a big thing, honestly, though. You know, to me, and the way we think about it is that's a symptom. You know, it's a symptom of institutional problems. It's not really the cause. You know, so when I see someone saying, "Oh, there's corruption," you know, like the United States are just extraditing President Toledo back to Peru, you know, because he's been accused of taking bribes from this Brazilian company Odebrecht. Okay, that's corruption. You know, basically, he took a backhand. You know, he put some money in his pocket, you know, in order to give these contracts to Odebrecht. Okay, but is that the problem? No, it's a symptom of the problem. It's a symptom of institutional problems in Peru, if you want that's the way we think that you should think about that. So, you know, is there corruption there's corruption everywhere. There's lots of corruption in Chicago, you know, there's corruption in Britain probably, but I would say it's very small scale compared to the type of corruption you see in Peru, you know, or the type of corruption you see in African countries, you know, modulo, you know, to this, I think it's difficult to interpret, you know, I would say in Africa. So there's many reasons I don't like talking about corruption, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I kind of get what you're getting at here. I mean, I guess the one thing I would say is that in America, more so even than Britain, that kind of donation is just given to a super PAC instead of a backhander. They've kind of legalized the ability to give quite hefty sums of money. And as long as it's not given in a direct pay for play scenario, they've legalized the edges of that in such that it's not legally wrong, but perhaps more morally in a sense. But even then, they don't feel bad because it's not illegal. I'd say that's probably the situation we've got. But I want to get to this idea that you've said it's a symptom. So are you suggesting that, for example, a politician who had been elected by constituents who could very easily eject him at the next election if he behaves improperly, a court system that will properly prosecute him, and a media that will report upon it accurately are the things that would, in an ideal and, like, you know, in the theoretically, you know, good democratic system, be all the checks that would stop that happening, and that's why it's a symptom.
Yeah, but I think transparency also, you know, I think what you're describing in the US is a big problem. You know, it's a big problem in terms of the function of the political system, but it's all kind of out in the open. You know, it's very transparent. It might not be good, but at least it's transparent, you know. And if it's transparent, you can do something about it. You know, the media can publicize it. People can become aware of it. You know, I give you a great example going back to Peru. You know, when President Fujimori was in power, he had a kind of his man called Vladimiro Montesinos, who was this sort of like, he was the guy who like managed the dictatorship. And Montesinos bribed everybody. He bribed congressmen, he bribed, you know, Supreme Court justices, you know, but the real action was the TV stations. You know, you could buy a congressperson for like $5,000 a month. You could buy a Supreme Court justice for $20,000 a month. To buy a TV station cost $1 million a month. Okay, so that's what they were really worried about, is the media shining a light on all the things they were doing. You know, so I think that you're right. I mean, I completely agree with you. I'm just saying that transparency is incredibly important, and you know, exactly what you're saying. These institutions of accountability, checks and balances, the judicial system. You know, he was bribing the judicial system, and to make sure he got away with it, and President Fujimori got all the decisions he wanted, he had to completely muzzle all of the media. And in fact, he was ratted out by the one TV station that he didn't bother bribing because he thought it was just like for rich kind of limeños, like people in Lima and upper class. It was all like arts and culture, and like no real people watched that, so he didn't need to bribe that.
Oh, that's fantastic. The one he didn't bother with.
Yeah, they ratted him out.
Yeah. I mean, it's you can forget about that one little station, and if they're providing good coverage, I think this is why the free market can be great in journalism, at least. That as long as there's lots of people saying lots of different things, eventually, theoretically, the truth you'll rise to the top, and the good journalism will succeed. I think we're in a weird situation with that, with the internet, but we'll power through, hopefully.
Yeah.
Thanks for making it all the way to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment for us in the comments below. Let me know what you thought, and if you'd like to see more of this from the show. Thank you, and we'll see you again next time.